Hello and welcome to the Cloud Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jonathan Brandon, Senior Staff Writer at businesscloudnews.com. This is the first in a series of presentations filmed at the Cloud World Forum in London, and today I'm pleased to be able to introduce Matthew Finnie, Chief Technology Officer at Interoute, one of Europe's largest telecommunications and cloud service providers. Matthew is currently responsible for driving the company's advanced services strategy, and in this presentation, he looks at how enterprises can apply certain guiding principles in order to effectively select cloud service providers that will help keep data safe and secure while allowing IT departments to retain control over their ICT infrastructure. In addition to highlighting the trade-offs between managed infrastructure and asset ownership approaches to IT systems, and by drawing on examples from a variety of enterprises, Matthew expounds his view that cloud infrastructure shouldn't be taken as a standalone solution, but rather should prompt enterprises to fundamentally rethink their IT architecture and infrastructure as a whole. Although this is a pre-recorded presentation, Matthew will be available to take your questions after the presentation. You can ask a question at any time by typing it into the text box on your screen, and Matthew will respond in real time. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Matthew.
Thank you very much. There's going to be plenty of hand jokes, right? I have to be careful, just thinking about it. But plenty of comments about that. Just a quick one on the title. The title is a compromise, as is life, as is the cloud to some extent. When I was asked to do this, they said, what are you going to talk about? And I said, well, I'm going to talk about the nature of the change of the command and control model of IT and how the cloud's disrupting it in a sort of more distributed way, which I thought would be a good topic. My marketing colleagues looked at me and went, to say that is dry is an understatement. So I said, all right, how about this? Out of control clouds, how to take back control and ride this puppy into the sunset. And they went, ooh, what is a puppy? But we like that one, right? So what you've got here is a hybrid between the two. What I want to talk about, and I'll do the very, very quick and brief, painlessly brief introduction to Interoute, who may not be a name you know. But what I want to talk about is I want to talk about how to think about this problem, right? One of the things that you will discover in the halls out there is everybody is going to think on your behalf about this problem, right? And in many cases, they may be right. In many cases, they may be wrong. But in all cases, they're trying to sell you something, right? So, you know, I would love to portray myself as the honest broker, the person who is going to deliver it, the truth, you know, those tablets of truth that you see. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to hopefully give you a guide to think about, whoa, right? I don't have to kill myself. I don't have to rush here. I can make sensible, circumspect decisions about what I want to do. If I get this right, it should work. So first off, who is Interoute? Interoute is Europe's largest infrastructure provider. To give you an idea, what that means is we have literally physical fiber that is 60,000 kilometers of lit fiber, and then what we do is we light it, we put services on it, and we go right to the top. I'll explain how someone who is so physical and has customers from every single incumbent in the globe to many of the people out there, and pretty much all of them are customers of ours in some way, shape or form. We are the guy that people buy from, generally speaking, if they want to build big infrastructure, big data centers, big networks. How do we get from this to the cloud? It is actually a very short journey, and I'll explain why. So our customers are many and varied, from the UEFA, which is obviously the European football folk, all of their IT, hosting all of that, 400 million visitors in last year, coming in a 4-week period, which was both spectacular and nerve-wracking. You don't have a concept of anything but 100% SLA during a 90-minute football match, saying, actually, I think you'll find 99.995 is pretty good. So that's great. But it was the penalty shootout, so it was not so good, right? So it's 100%. And also the folks at ESA. And we literally do everything for ESA from the ground to the cloud. Interoute is the infrastructure behind Dante and Géant, which is the research network infrastructure. But it's also, we're working with the folks at the European Space Agency to do the Earth observation, data processing, the square kilometer array, and these other programs and the folks at CERN. because we provide them with a big, massive parallel processing platform. And the key thing for us is we think about everything from the ground to the cloud in very simple sense. You have real stuff, right? Real stuff like these hands. These hands are real. You can touch them. You can take them away with you. And then you have virtual stuff. And the point about virtual stuff is this means effectively, one way to think about this is trust. Trust and capital. If you've got a lot of money and you want to do it all yourself, and that's the business you're in, and some of the very large folks out here operate that way, they will buy physical infrastructure from us. And then we will manage that infrastructure and they will do their thing. Many enterprise customers, many large websites will come to us and say, well, actually, do you know what? You've got big operational environments. You can run all that stuff for me. I just want to have control of the bit where I add intellectual value. The rest of it, I want to give to you. So we think about it in a very simple sense. You have real network, and then you have virtual network. You have real computing, and you have virtual computing. You have real colo, and you have virtual colo, right? And the thing you're trusting is trusting us to manage things. This is how, by the way, with every service provider, you should kind of think about it. And obviously, for those, the word that seems to be buzzing around the hall at the moment is hybrid, right? Which means different, right? Two things which are different. This is inherently a hybrid model. But enough about Interoute. Let's move on to the topic in hand. So, is it chaotic or is it the cloud? Or are they the same thing? Do we have to assume, because it's this new thing, we have to assume this new paradigm? Those of us who were around in the dot-com boom will remember people saying, it's a new paradigm. You don't actually make money, right? What you do is get lots of users. And it didn't turn out to be the case. You know, businesses are businesses because they have to turn a profit. So I think one of the things is, people talk about new paradigm. You've got to strip away what people mean by that. And many times they kind of mean, we can't do what it is you want to do, so we're going to call it new, right? And this new thing kind of gets around the old thing that you used to do. Sometimes new is better, sometimes new is a compromise, and you've just got to pick your way through it. So in terms of the cloud, right, or it as a concept, we either love it or we hate it. Apologies to folks outside of the UK, and this may mean absolutely nothing to you. For those here, we'll all have a little chuckle about the relevance of it. But you've got different people are going to win out of this. Different people are doing well. So smartphones and tablets are driving growth. I can say as a network provider, we're chucking on terabits of capacity every year on behalf of the internet. It's all consumers, right? It is not corporate customers, it's all consumers. It's phones, it's broadband, it's the fact, think about it, you go to a wedding, right? And someone takes 200 photos, you've just chucked on a couple of gig, right? And that's happening over and over again. Everyone in this hall will produce probably a terabyte of content by the end of the week, of personal content in variety of different forms. Terabyte's probably small for this hall, right, in terms of all the people. We are relentlessly producing stuff that we want to put somewhere. We have the data center traffic we see is being driven by, if you like, cloud consumption. Cloud consumption being stuff where people are saying the amount of data being moved around. So there is a clear online shift. We see that, everybody's familiar with it. The channel is a different tale, right? That's a tale of two things. Wild opportunity and imminent demise. And you have to kind of pick your poison. The key thing to bear in mind, if your business was putting stuff in racks for people and charging them good money for project managing the placement of stuff in racks, that business is probably going to go away, right? But if your business is, as we've discovered with our services, if your business is working with folks who want to advise intellectually on build stuff, like the guys we've worked with ESA, a bunch of smart guys out of CERN who've built this very clever API engine, they stick it on top of our technology, and you can launch hundreds of servers at a time and bring them down, then all of a sudden, this kind of opportunity is like the internet was way back when all of a sudden the famous one was the coffee shop in Hawaii now goes global. You as a service provider or a channel can go global with this model because your ability to deliver service is now unfettered. And then you have the enterprise. And in fairness, the enterprise is a story whereby spending is flat, but the spending is there. The spending is just on different stuff. And what people are looking to do, in our experience, is looking to consolidate their services, looking to get rid of infrastructure they don't need. So, much of the focus in terms of cloud is really being passed on a fairly narrow definition. And this is the issue I've always had with it, is people talk about the pros and cons, scale, cost, choice, next generation, we know the pros. It's the cons where I somewhat struggle with some people's definition. And I just picked out, these are all real comments from real people, not made up by Interoute marketing. The scale and predictability. People are saying it takes a lot of engineering to bring the private cloud scaling and security into the public cloud. Or you're going to get locked in. Or if you want to use this capability, you're going to have to surrender control. That quote is from the CTO of Zynga, who said, if you want 64 gig of memory here, you can't do that. You buy another instance. What people are doing is using a very narrow reference. It's early days, right? What we're advocating is kind of stepping back from that. Reliability and speed. A number of people say to me, what about latency, right? The experience of other technologies is that latency reduces, speeds go up, right? You've got to understand that the provisioning of computing, by and large, is fairly immature at a level of sophistication from a technology perspective. We put lots of blocks in the way, mainly at a network level. And what you've got to think about is what is the optimal model for this thing? How will it actually look? And therefore you can make some kind of value judgment. But what's happening is folks are, if you like, flight to the cloud. And what they're creating is a bunch of tactical clouds, or as an American colleague just mentioned to me, shadow IT or rogue IT. Folks who go off and do, one of the most common ones I see is CRM, right? Sales heads who've had enough of their internal IS department saying it's hard, it's going to take a lot of time, and they just go off and use Salesforce. And so what you're doing is you're taking what is largely an on-premise and possibly inflexible model, but then you're kind of scattering data to the wind. And I think one of the things people have to wrestle with is if I want to buy these point solutions, then you are losing, which for most people, is you're losing that relationship between those pieces of data. Of course, when we build our solutions, what we all try and do, and this is what we do, and this is what many of the big providers out there do, because we know they do, is they will pick and choose carefully how they build a solution. They'll think about the network, they'll think about the compute and storage, they'll think about the OS, they'll think about the application layer, they'll write it themselves. The key thing to remember here is if you are building this at an efficiency level, what you're going to look for is efficiencies. Which bits do you really care about? Which bits do you not care about? And the key thing to remember, and this is one of the things you kind of got to make a decision. One of the risks you run with a lot of the way a lot of clouds, if you like, are put forward right now, is that you run the risk of creating your own cloud silo, because it's easy, right? You say, well, actually, do you know what? It'd just be much easier if I pulled that bit in here, because it's hard to get it out of here. And it's this sort of, you're moving from one siloed model to some extent to another siloed model, which of course encourages in a new industry of folks who will then provide you tools to manage across all these different clouds. But if you think about it at a data level, at a repository level, it's actually, what you're doing is sort of, you've got an inefficient model, so you're compromising. And then you say, well, actually, I've just created an inefficient model, and now I need to layer on top of the inefficient model another layer of visibility such that I can then manage all these different silos, right? Which those who've been around with network management systems and single pane of glass type models will know this is never as easy as it says, the magic piece of software is going to be. So what we believe, and I think most people would advocate, is the basic genesis of what you're trying to do with cloud computing or with the virtualization of your infrastructure is to liberate yourself, right? To give you more flexibility and not just create a new problem where you're saying, well, actually, I've got to apply a piece of software to manage all my disparate bits of hybrid entities, right? And I think what ends up happening is you say, well, actually, I'm not going to change, right? I'm going to hang on to it for a little while longer, and I think it's a good idea. Is it a good idea? No, flat no, right? History tells us, and we have historical reference from communications infrastructure, network infrastructure, that hanging on to legacy is an inevitability of you're going to go down a route where you're going to become increasingly inefficient, right? And the problem with it is that we've seen it with networks, we've seen it with communications. You basically are more and more inefficient as the later you would start to adopt these kind of things. So you kind of got to make a decision how you want to go forward. But what you've got to remember is you should think about this as a catalyst, as a mechanism to start your understanding of your architectures. Think about it as a way of refreshing your own mind about what it is you're trying to do. So then you want to choose your cloud, right? So that's for argument's sake, and this is an analyst's view of the world. People are saying, I'm not ready for that kind of cloud, because they've got a cloud in mind, right? And in some ways, and this is an analyst's view, there are consumer clouds, Amazon, AWS, Google. These are clouds which are frictionless in terms of the way they acquire users. Everybody knows Amazon, everybody knows Google, right? And you can give them a credit card and off you go, happy days. You've got vendor clouds, Microsoft, Oracle, these guys. They say, we will combine the application with the infrastructure and you can get it all together. And then what we would advocate is a model which is an open cloud. Now, I stress this is not open in the sense of I'm a more open group than that open group over there, right? This is not the open source debate where everybody forms a closed shop of open source guys to talk about their open source and competes against everybody else to be more open source. This is what I talk about when I think about open, is keep your options open, right? When we're talking about hybrid clouds, how do you build a hybrid computing infrastructure now? You generally speaking say, I've got to manage between an application layer and I've got to have some visibility at the network, right? Don't start unpicking what is fundamentally cost effective. We've squeezed a lot of cost out, something just because you're moving to a new model. So if you look at two sort of classic architectures, web presence and enterprise, the key thing is look at something that offers you a very low barrier to entry, right? Because at the end of the day, your experience of whether this is going to work might be, you might have one set of experiences now versus how you think it's going to evolve is our experience building these things at a fairly industrial level is the first thing you have to do is make sure you don't get yourself tied into anyone's vision of the future. Doesn't mean you don't, you go off and hire a bunch of coders and write your own orchestration engine and do it yourself. But have your architecture use as basic and as obvious a level of interaction as you can. Open standards that I like, HTML, it's an open standard, right? BGP, MPLS, Ethernet, SIP. These things exist and have existed to do the right thing, and you can structure an architecture. It's not a good idea necessarily to go off and go down a route which means you're kind of stuck with someone else's view of the planet. So thinking it through, an open approach. So what I'm going to talk about is the primary concern for most people is data confidentiality and availability of the service. At the end of the day, that's what it is. If you're taking data, you're placing it somewhere, you want it to be there, you want the data to be there, and you want the service to be up. This can be subverted on the data side through infiltration of a shared system, shared LAN segments, or most times inadequately enforced access controls. So most data goes missing from most companies because the people in charge of the data don't manage their access controls well enough. On the other side, you want to look at high availability. We're all very familiar with the stories about availability and the things that went wrong. Most of the time, there's some of the cloud disaster stories. It's got nothing to do with the cloud, right? Nothing to do with the infrastructure. Most of the time, it's to do with some poor soul has done a database rollback, gone off for Christmas, and it didn't work, right? And so the whole thing comes tumbling down. The issue here is be clear about what it is you're trying to make available, the application space, the infrastructure space. But pick a platform you can work with, right? And one of the things we would always strongly advocate, and I'm sure there's an undercurrent of I bet you would, is that the internet has been the most prolific and useful platform we've had for a long time. It introduced itself into how we build things. Back in 1999, we were still a world of not networks. We didn't have anything in the network. We were a disparate world. And then along came this chap. In fact, he didn't come along at all. He just wrote a paper about it. Does anyone actually know who he is? I'll give a hand to anyone who does. A chap called David Eisenberg, right? He was an AT&T engineer who advocated the rise of the dumb network in 1997. I was at the States in the time, and he was like, almost, he was the emperor has no clothes. He said his employer was basically in trouble, right? But what happened subsequent to that is things like technologies like MPLS came along, the kind of cousin of IP, and we started steadily moving things into networks. Why? Because you had an in the network concept. It existed, right? In the same way that the internet has existed. It's the private label separation side of it. So use platforms that you know. Networks are things that you know. Networks are readily available, and they are very scalable and very inexpensive, right? We know that because that's what we've been doing for the last 10, 15 years. The next issue is how real can we make this computer? And one of the issues, if we go back to this, one of the issues we always forget about this is you start thinking about the computing, right? The thing you need to think about is the network, right? Because the compromise starts when you say, oh, I've just got to assume it's out there and it's a computer, right? Because then you will use things like firewalls to define a network domain, which is fine. It's expensive and it's inefficient. It is much easier to virtualize the network. And this is something that Interoute has done. Those familiar with software-defined networking or network function virtualization, we actually did this from our own in-house perspective, but what it allows us to do is say we've got a common virtualized network which allows us to insert assets, be them at a switch level for a customer, be them at a managed device, or be them as a complete virtualized device. This gives you a simple tiered approach whereby we're not advocating, or this architecture is not advocating, that you should think about your services and your assets in a way which means I've got to go with this software guy who does it all for me, right? This is open, vanilla, anybody can do it. What you then do, and this is what we have done, is we insert the computing into the network. We do not make the computing a customer of the network. It is inserted into it. So the computing is defined by the network access you give it. So in the general sense of the word, when you get a cloud computing instance, you will be given a cloud computing instance with a public IP address, right? You will then stick a firewall on it, job's a good one, you're off. In this instance, we will ask you a question just before you get that. We'll say, do you want to attach the VLAN from that hypervisor to a private label-separated VRF, or do you want to attach the VLAN from that hypervisor to a public IP address? Or do you want to build a real DMZ and do both, right? What you're doing is you're mimicking, or not even mimicking, you are replicating exactly the same process you would have you build in a real data center. Our goal, our aspiration here, and this is from experience of doing it with networks and to some extent with communications computing, is if you make it the tools as real as you can, you give people the opportunity to kind of dip in and dip out, right? So you're not saying, I'm going to embrace the whole thing, I'm going to take on those bits that make sense to me. What we then do is we build it into the network. One of the things we know about the internet, when was the last time the internet didn't work? And by that I mean not your broadband provider dug up the road and you didn't have access to it. I mean the internet probably stopped working, right? Yes, you have spats between some of the big tier ones, largely Cogent and others, about whether you have access. But fundamentally, it doesn't stop, right? So you employ the same model to resilience. You build out the computing into the network. And then you have what we do, because we give the network away. We don't charge you for the network between these computing zones. So you can have 5 zones, and you can connect them all up, and you could run them all 5 in parallel. And then that would be as high availability as you can conceive of. Statistically, if you get to 3 locations, you are now in a realms, statistically, 3 to 4, of having a level of resilience which is sort of on a par with getting to 2 like DNA matches. So fairly high levels of resilience. Obviously, the maths is somewhat subject. It depends how you think about resilience and single systems. But fundamentally, you spread it across there. So what this now gives you, this gives you access to the data. It's your data. You place it anywhere. No one else touches it. It's not our data. We don't take it and dedupe it and do this kind of thing. It's your data. It's your block. You have it. You can have as many locations as you want. So you tick the old high availability. You tick the old confidentiality and integrity buttons. So I've got something that means I'm safe to move. It's safe to go. But what else do I want from this thing? Well, you know, it's secure, it's open. I haven't really done anything that's out of the ordinary. It's using protocols I'm familiar with. But what about the other things I want? Because I really do want this cloud thing. So what we've also done is we've layered on another layer of automation. And into that, we've placed some of the well-known brands you know and love. Everything from Red Hat, Microsoft, obviously, NetApp, who use us as their private cloud connection for their enterprise customers, and Riverbed, Stonesoft, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the appliance as you would buy the physical appliance, but it's a virtual appliance. And you've got access and real control of the network. So you can build real things with stuff that you're familiar with. Also, you get to use a whole host of what I would call some very exciting things. But the other big benefit of doing this approach and using it, it's fast. In fact, it's a lot faster than the existing. Why? Because it's built into the core. So we used the Intel LinPack test, which was done for us, and it's 3 times faster than the equivalent AWS machine. So in that regard, people say, well, why is it so quick? Well, it's going to be quick, right? You're inserting a set of computing resources right into a core backbone with 20 gigs worth of capacity running on a blade. It's going to run very, very fast, which is what it does, right? Because Interoute, understand, is as much of the network in Europe as pretty much anyone. So you get a faster experience, you get a more varied experience, but still you are working within something that is able to do everything, as I said, from football to space exploration. And we're not changing the way in which you want to think about the problem, right? That's down to you. You have the opportunity to change, but we're not forcing you down that route. So don't just survive. What we'd like to say is thrive in this, right? So avoid lock-in. Don't wait for consensus to reign on standards, right? It is a waste. You could wait forever, trust me. Crack on with stuff that you know and work within those constraints. Stick with security you know. Data separation works, it's audited, people like it. Reliable, look at the SLA. A number of times people say to me, what about the SLA? Look at the SLA, read it, does it make sense to you? If it does, then go with that SLA. If it doesn't, or you think it's questionable, don't use it. Faster, it should be faster, right? It shouldn't be a compromise, it should actually be speeded up. That's been our experience of everything else. Predictability, you should be able to get predictability. Predictability is a function of management of resources and a function of management of latencies. Those should be under the provider's control, and therefore you can get true intermarket latency and intermarket resilience. And always keep control, and you can then take back control. If you want to cede it and give it to someone, then you have the option. But the thing you're not compromising is your ability to make that decision. The ability to rewrite your app to make it work in the cloud. To, as they say, if you're going to put it into the public cloud, learn to fail, right? You don't have to learn to fail. The thing will just continue to work. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And as I said at the outset, Matthew is now available to take your questions, which you can ask by typing into the text box on your screen.
you.